Boesenecker. And also joining us this morning is Representative Judy Amabile from House District 13 and Representative Mary Young from House District 50. Today's topic is the state of our economy, where we are, and what to expect. And we're honored to have two excellent presenters, Colorado State Treasurer David Young and Professor Anders Fremstad from the Department of Economics at Colorado State University. My name is Beth Jager, and I will be your moderator for the next 60 minutes. After a brief welcome by our legislators, Treasurer Young and Professor Fremstad will present their remarks. Then we will open the session for your questions about today's topic. And you will be able to ask your questions in one of two ways. The first way is that you can click on the chat box on the bottom of your screen and type in your question. Or if you prefer to ask your question live, then click on the reaction icon at the bottom of the screen. And in that, you'll see a raised hand function. Click on that. I'll see your virtual hand. I will call on you. Please remember to unmute yourself and to introduce yourself. And then after your question is answered, please go back on mute so we can minimize background noise. And as always, I'm going to ask that you please ask your questions and offer your remarks in a respectful manner so that our discussion this morning is very productive. So with that, let's begin with brief introductory remarks from our local legislators. And Senator Ginal, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Beth and Vicki, for facilitating this legislative forum. And I'm not going to say much because I want to hear from our presenters. And I'm looking forward to hearing about how our economy is doing, as well as what's going to happen in 2022 and beyond. And I can't think of two better folks to be able to help us and guide us through understanding what's going on in the economy. So I'm going to pass it over to Representative Kipp for comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Beth and Vicki, as always, for being our wonderful moderators. And thank you to Flint for managing the technology for us. I just want to say a special welcome to Representative Amabile, who hasn't joined us before, but I just want to let you know that she is going to be part of our Larimer County Democratic contingent starting in when the lines become officially drawn. So she is one of our new Larimer County legislators. So that is one of the reasons we really wanted her to join us today. And we're always want to welcome Mary Young from Greeley because she's our neighbor just to the east.
Great, thank you. Representative Amabile.
Hi. Thank you guys so much for having me here today. And thanks everybody for taking time out on your Saturday morning to hear this information. And I'm sure we're going to all learn a lot. I currently represent House District 13, which is western part of Boulder, Gilpin, Clear Creek, Grand, and Jackson counties. But with the redistricting, I am going to be running for House District 49, which is the western part of Boulder, Clear Creek, Gilpin, and Larimer County, the rural parts of Larimer County, mostly west of 287. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm very happy to have inherited the rural parts of Larimer County. And I hope today we're going to learn how we can help the people who suffered the most economically through the pandemic recover well, because they're the ones that have lost the most and have gained back the least. And that's one of the areas that I'm really interested in.
Thank you. Representative Young.
Well, thank you to Beth and Vicki and Flint for organizing us in this virtual world. As many of you know, I represent parts of Greeley, Evans, and Garden City, and I'm happy for the invitation to participate, and I'm happy to see several of my constituents on this call. I had the honor of being on the interim task force on economic recovery and relief cash fund, which was established to make recommendations on how to use the American Rescue Plan Act money. And our goals were to provide a stimulative effect on the state's economy, as Rep. Amabile was saying, provide necessary relief for Coloradans and address disparities resulting from the pandemic. We had over 70 proposals, and we're in the process of looking at those, and there will be bills this year coming forward to address those needs. And so I'm especially interested in today's conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Representative Boesenecker.
Well, thank you, Beth. Certainly appreciate you and Vicki always pulling these wonderful conversations together for us, and wonderful to see everybody this morning. Thanks for joining us. I couldn't be more excited about our presenters this morning and our discussion topic, which is obviously very timely as we continue to recover from the pandemic and work on what we can do to help folks who, as Representative Amabile said, have been disproportionately impacted. So incredibly excited about our discussion today. I represent the west half of Fort Collins in House District 53, and certainly happy to have all of my colleagues here today as well. It's going to be a great time together. I won't offer any more remarks, but if it's all right, Beth, I'll just jump in with introducing our panelists and would love to give them the most of the time to share what they have to offer with us this morning. So this morning we are pleased to welcome Colorado State Treasurer Dave Young. Among other things, and I won't do a deep dive on anybody's bio, but I did just want to mention that Treasurer Young previously served in the state legislature, and then something I always like to highlight, he was also a teacher, an educator right here in Northern Colorado, and I think that's just a wonderful lens to bring to any conversation. Once a teacher, always a teacher, I say. And then we're also pleased to welcome today Professor Anders Fremstad, who is an associate professor in the economics department at CSU. I've known Anders for a long time in our community and just have really benefited from his wisdom on multiple topics. I did want to share that his research has also focused on the political economy of the environment, especially the sharing economy and the climate crisis. So some very timely and helpful data points, I'm sure, for us to talk about today. So with that, I will gladly turn it over to Colorado State Treasurer Dave Young.
Well, thank you, Representative Boesenecker, and Beth and Vicki, thank you for inviting me. It's so great to see my friends from the time that I served in the legislature. I really appreciate that. And I think I've started to share my screen already, so let me answer this question so you actually get the slides that I plan to share today. But before I jump into them, I just also wanted to add a little flavor there. I am a graduate of CSU. So I graduated with a major in math and my teaching credentials, a minor in physics and minor in philosophy. So what you didn't hear in there was that I had a major or minor in economics. So we're fortunate to have Professor Fremstad with us today. I will tell you in my role as treasurer that I do work quite a bit with experts in the field, economists, financial advisors, and lots of other people in the financial services sector. So we spend quite a bit of time talking about these issues. I listen intently. There's some themes that have emerged through that conversation over the past couple of years as we've been in this downturn. And I've already told Professor at any point if he wants to jump in on my slides, I think there's probably going to be a little overlap between those. But, you know, if he wants to jump in and make a comment, feel free, Professor, that's more than welcome. So let me go quickly here because I want to be sure that we have enough time. I do want to remark, just like Representative Young did, and by the way, we're coming from the same house because, well, we're related. We're married, right? So we're over here in Greeley. And she's going to drop off and come back in. She's got another meeting, but you know, she's using that as an excuse. I think she's tired of hearing me and wants to come back and hear the professor actually, but I'm threw in a slide here and it's kind of got a bunch of information on here. And again, I defer to the professor, but I've just grabbed this information because I think in the big picture of things, sometimes we listen to the news a lot and we go, wow, the economy is either really hot or the economy is doing poorly, and it's because you're hearing reports about the stock market. And interestingly, early on in the economic downturn after the pandemic hit, I'm very active at the national level with the National Association of State Treasurers. And we invited the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, in to spend about an hour with us, kind of an armchair fireside talk with all of the treasurers across the country. And the thing that stuck with me was the headline of this slide, and that is the stock market is not the economy. It's part of it, but I think sometimes we overreact to the news about the markets and forget that there's a bigger picture of this, and I'm sure the professor will weigh in on that as well. So I went and grabbed just some statistics. You could grab any year. I kind of didn't want to grab it from the last 2 years, but 2019, you can see the biggest proportion of or percent of the economy, or the gross domestic product, really came from personal consumption. And so, it's not that the business investment and stock market or government spending aren't important in that equation, but you can see that, personal consumption really is a big part of that. And so, as we talk about the big moving pieces of the economy, and I have some additional slides I'll go quickly through because I know the professor will cover a lot of that as well. Always keep it in this frame that really what's happening on Main Street is more important maybe than Wall Street. And it's not that I'm dismissive of Wall Street, but that we really need to focus. And I think these legislators that we have here in Northern Colorado that are on this call are really laser focused on how do we really improve the lot for people across the state of Colorado, and particularly those that were hit the hardest during the pandemic. I always want to take a moment to tell a little bit about what I do and what the treasurer does, and I'm going to post in the chat feature my email, treasurer.young@state.co.us later. And, if you want a copy of these slides, just email that email address and I'll send it off to you. But you can see that everything we do is about money, which is why I pay so close attention to the experts and what they're saying about the economy and about the markets as well. We look very closely what is going on with business and business development. So you can see I chair a bunch of boards. I might mention right here, because there may be questions about PARA. I am a member of the PARA board, the Public Employees Retirement Association, the public pension for Colorado for public employees, but I'm not the spokesperson. So I always say that up front. I'm happy to talk about PARA, but those are my remarks. They don't represent PARA or the board. The chair of the board, Marcus Pinnell, and the executive director, Ron Baker, are the spokespersons for PARA. But you can see that I chair other boards. I'll highlight two. Climber actually is in response. It's a board that was created through law by these legislators to help us deal with the effects of the economy after the pandemic. And it really is focused on small businesses because we know that they are the backbone and maybe overrepresented business-wise in our state. And we're also standing up a secure savings program, Colorado Secure Savings Program, for over 1 million workers here in the state of Colorado in the private sector who don't have access to a retirement savings plan. And I only mention these is because these have economic components to them, and I'm happy to get deeper in there if there's questions about that. But you can see I chair those, but as you see, we in the Treasury manage the complex checkbook of the state, and a lot of agencies have checkbooks. So a lot of people are writing checks all the time. Of course, it's really just wire transfers and ACHs, but it's really a very complicated situation. We watch very carefully what's happening with the economy so we can manage our cash flows. Safety of the taxpayer dollars is the number one and most important task of the Treasury. Liquidity, to make sure we have enough to cover our obligations. And then finally, the return on investment that we get is third. So we do pay attention to that, and that's why we look at these different programs as well. So let me move on. You can see we managed a very conservative investment portfolio. If you haven't, by the way, I always have to put in a plug. February 1st is National Unclaimed Property Day. If you haven't gone to the Great Colorado Payback and checked to see if you have unclaimed property, please do that. We also manage debt. And so that's another area where we actually go into the market and we participate in the market to sell issuances so that we can manage debt as well. So I just wanted to show you that this is a very important topic to us, the state of the economy, and we watch it very closely. So I mentioned that I look at different and get advice from lots of different experts, but we have some of the best experts, not the only experts. Professor is a great one, but we actually have legislative council staff, our nonpartisan staff at the Capitol that actually present quarterly to the Joint Budget Committee our economic and revenue forecasts. And I have slides, not all of them, but some of them from their December 2021 presentation that are embedded in my my deck here, and we'll go quickly through those because I think some of these are ones that the professor is also going to talk about as well. But I just wanted you to be aware that we have really good information. I was on the Joint Budget Committee for 4 years and quarterly listen to these reports, and it's very helpful. The one thing I always tell people, and I'm sure the professor will tell you, that any predictions about the economy will always be wrong. Let me repeat that. If you're, and you know this from the weather, right? You know, they're getting better, but you know, it's always going to be not exactly right. And so as you look at these slides, and they always qualify this too, it's like, this is our most educated estimate of what's going to happen, but it may not actually pan out that way. And so this is the real pathway of our gross domestic product as a nation. This isn't Colorado. And you can see that dramatic dip as a result of the recession that occurred after the pandemic. And you kind of get a sense as you look at that we have recovered. But there's also another piece of this, and you can see projected growth looks that way as well. Remember, these are averages, and averages can mask what's happening to individuals and individual sectors of the economy. And so some sectors of the economy may not have been affected at all. Others were dramatically affected and may not have recovered yet. We'll see a little bit of that as we get further on here. Here's our unemployment rate compared to the US. You can see a little bit higher unemployment rate still than the country. And again, if you go around the state, you may see a wide range of unemployment rate depending on where you are geographically in the state. And again, the professor is going to talk about some of this, so I'm sure I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Let me click through. Some states have already regained all of the jobs they lost. We have not quite yet, but we're getting close. And this gives you a little bit more deeper flavor of really what happened. You can see this slide really breaks it down by sector. Look at accommodations and food service. This is our, one of our bigger sectors because we are a tourist destination. And you can see how hard it was hit and that it has come back, but it's still in a deficit. And you can track that down through all the different sectors. And some weren't hit as hard and have come back and are beyond where they were before the recession. So it is an interesting, deeper look at this. And again, these are all tagged with where the data comes from. Certainly, if you've been reading at all, inflation is a concern, and the economy is hot. Inflation has been climbing. This is U.S. city average, both headline and core inflation, and you can see a little definition at the very bottom of the slide if you squint, what the difference is between headline and core inflation, and then it's broken out there. And then the next slide, again, I'm going to move through these quickly because I know the professor wants to speak to these as well. You see a similar but slightly different take for the state, which is the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood CPI. Headline a little lower than the rate for the nation, but core a little higher than the nation, and it's broken out as well. And so The pandemic, it says on this slide, remains in the driver's seat. And I think this is why I caution people about what they think is going to happen in the future. We do know that the pandemic has had this unsettling effect on the economy, very dramatic effect initially, and it is a different kind. It produced a different kind of recession. And I've heard economists say, and the professor can, maybe add more flavor to this or go a different direction, but some of our recessions, like we had in 2008, 2009, were the result of failure of the mechanism of the financial services sector, and through infusion of money and through legislative work and other work, you can recover from that. But to some extent, this pandemic and the economic downturn that resulted and may in the future also occur is a consumer confidence issue. So people are a little reluctant to travel to Colorado because of the effects of COVID, or they're a little reluctant to be in large groups where we have venues or restaurants. And we've come back, and then we had another variant, and then that changes the reflection of everything. And so we watch this carefully, but it's a little harder to predict because of that. And you can see that the Ledge Council has actually said near-term risks appear to be weighted to the downside. So as you look at their slide here on the downside, continued supply and demand mismatches, inflation, accelerated monetary policy, waning fiscal stimulus are all things that happen. And we did receive the American Rescue Plan money and the CARES Act money through the Treasury. And the ARP money, the American Rescue Plan money, the $3.8 billion that came in, some of it was appropriated in 2021, but the legislators are working now on bills that will appropriate the rest of it, somewhere around, I believe, $2.5 billion. It's a lot of money, but when you look at the real impact of this, it's good one-time money that can be smartly invested, but it's not sustainable. So we really need to focus on things that actually move our economy back into equilibrium again. And I kind of like to think of what's happened, and maybe it's not a good analogy, maybe the professor has a better one, but if you've ever watched a freight train that's stopped on the siding and then starts to get started again, you see the boxcars start to bounce against each other as they get going. And I think that a little bit of what you see listed in the downside are the boxcars kind of bouncing against each other as we try to get all moving in the same direction. And people will say, well, that should work its way out over time, but when is the big question. And so what we look at in the downside was what the Federal Reserve is going to do. And I'm just going to put this up there because Congress has directed the Federal Reserve to really look at the monetary policies of the nation, and really with the focus of producing maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate got my slide cover there, long-term interest rates. So when the pandemic hit, the recession hit, March of 2020, they started buying bonds because money was flowing out of the bond market. People were asking for more cash in their pocket. Investors were, and didn't want them tied up in bonds. But bonds are our debt market that actually allow us to build infrastructure and fund the debt of businesses. And so they were busy buying bonds, and they also lowered interest rates as well, near to zero. But now that the economy is heated up, you're going to see them start to roll off the bonds that they bought from their portfolio. And if you watch the news, they already had a meeting where there's a discussion of at least 4 times over the year coming up, 2022, that they will likely do a 1/4 point increase in the interest rates to try to cool off the economy a little bit. That may be too extreme, or it may not be extreme enough. I had a conversation with my investment team yesterday at the Capitol, and the markets seem to feel like that there may be as many as 7 interest rate increases throughout this year and 2023. But again, that's forecasting. We don't know, and we don't really know how the conditions will change. and the Federal Reserve will meet often. So to make decisions. Let me just finish by showing you the slide that has my contact information. And again, that treasure.young@state.co.us. If you email that, and I'll put it in the chat, if you email that address and want a copy of the slide deck so you can look a little bit more deeply at the slides and the information that's in there, feel free to do that. You can also email me with other questions that may not be answered today. Happy to answer those as well. And with that, let me stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you, Beth. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasurer Young. Very informative. Professor Fremstad, would you like to offer your remarks?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to be echoing a lot of what Treasurer Young was just telling us. So you folks all see my slides now, I believe.
Yes.
So I'm Anders Fremstad. I teach and do research at Colorado State University, and I'm very happy to be here today. I want to echo what Treasurer Young noted about, the economy is built on top of people, of course, and so it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the economy without knowing exactly what's going to happen with our COVID crisis. We're presently coming down from our most recent peak in cases and hopefully hospitalizations and deaths soon too. But of course, building a healthy, prosperous, and equitable economy requires us to have a healthy populace. And so I think we have to continue working with public health experts and so on to take care of that first. That said, so I'm going to be presenting mostly public data. This is from FRED, which is the St. Louis Federal Reserve. Here's employment in Colorado. You can see we haven't reached the peak. We're still down about 40,000 jobs from where we were in January 2020, and over 100,000 jobs less than where we would have been if we'd stayed on this earlier trend. So we have some to do, but of course we have recovered from the depth of our recession, which was the highest rate of unemployment we'd had in this country in 50 years or so. So we had unemployment rate of 12% in spring 2020. We're down now to 4.8% last month. That's still elevated above the 2 to 3% we had right before the COVID pandemic. And I think we want to be able to continue the growth of the economy till we have a tight labor market again. The reason, of course, that we care about having tight labor markets is tight labor markets are typically when wages go up for workers. Here's some data from the Atlanta Fed that tracks median wages. So the wages of the typical work over time, and this is looking at median wage growth. So if you look at the United States and then the Mountain Census Division, you can see that actually, unlike most other recessions, in the COVID recession, the median wages didn't go down. We've continued to have relatively strong growth, slightly stronger here in the Mountain Division than the United States as a whole. And if you look over here to the second panel, you see that wages have particularly gone up actually for high school graduates. And that's actually happening for almost the first time in the 40 years or so you see in this series. And so I think that's actually a bit of good news, a little bit of wage compression helping out those, especially on the bottom of the wage distribution. Of course, we don't just care about nominal wage growth, right? Because prices matter too. Krugman argued just a couple of days ago in his newsletter, New York Times, that that's kind of what we should be looking at. And there, if you take perspective for the US as a whole, you see in year-over-year data, real wages, so nominal wage growth minus price increase growth, the growth of the consumer price index, was still slightly positive in 2021. Here's a similar amount, similar data for Colorado. You can see it's actually turned just slightly negative recently, although it's still not as bad as it was, say, in 2016, when price increases outstripped wage increases by a much larger degree in Colorado. So I think that's something to be watching. And I think there's been a lot of talk about what's happening to prices and so on. I would note that wage growth has actually been fairly robust throughout this crisis. Krugman points to the power of narrative in his recent piece. I think it's a point worth taking seriously. If you ask Americans today how they feel about the national economy, that is in fact, well, they don't feel very confident about it, or not as confident as they did before the COVID crisis. That's the blue and the yellow lines. But if you ask people about how they feel about their personal finances, people are actually doing pretty close to how they said they were doing before the crisis. And so I think some of the fears around inflation and price increases have been sort of overblown. It's something that economists, folks like me, have to think about a lot, but I think the media has played it up a bunch, and there are a bunch of other things we need to keep in perspective. When we do think about inflation, I think it's important to step back a little bit and realize how prices have changed over longer term rather than just over the last couple months or quarters. Over the last 20 or so years, if you look at how prices have changed, what you see is huge inflation in the price of things like hospital services, college tuition, childcare, right? You see almost no increase in the price of new cars or furniture or clothing over the last 20 years, right? Despite nominal wage increases. So those things have actually gotten cheaper for the average worker over the last 20 years, and huge decreases in the price of things like TVs and toys and software and so on. So I think that's important to keep in perspective, because some of the things the necessities that life requires are the things where the prices have actually gone up the most. And we should be focusing, I think, on policies that make sure that Americans have what they need of hospital services, medical care, college, childcare, and so on. And I think that's a place to focus what we're doing, and not worry too much about temporary and relatively minor increases in some produced goods that are closer to frivolities and are actually fairly affordable over in a long-term sort of perspective. I think a big caveat here locally is that we have had huge inflation in housing prices, right? So according to Zillow.com, the median home in Fort Collins now sells for $535,000. That's a 20% increase over the last year. That's clearly an unaffordable price for the vast majority of workers in our city. And I think that's a serious problem that we need to address. If we look at rental rates for a 3-bedroom apartment today, that's also up over 20% over last year, according to Zumper.com, now at $2,200 for a 3-bedroom apartment. That's more than a minimum wage worker can earn working full-time for a month, right? So I think that is the sort of thing, that's the sort of inflation we really need to think about if we want to build an equitable, fair, and prosperous economy. Locally, we need affordable housing. People need a place to live. And I think we should seriously think about policies that keep those prices high, including policies that make it hard to build sort of dense, affordable housing, policies that prevent people from grouping together and living, policies like U+2. And I think, like some other cities, we should be thinking seriously about the possibility of using regulations like rent control to provide renters with the same sort of security, housing security, that homeowners rely upon all the time, right? Where they know exactly how much they're going to pay every month into the future, and can't be easily evicted. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much for having me here. It's always fun to talk to my neighbors and fellow citizens of the area. So an honor to be here with you today. Happy to take your questions. We'll move on to that.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Fremstad. I've learned a lot already this morning. We're now going to open it up to your questions to Treasurer Young and Professor Fremstad. Again, remember, you can type your question into chat, or you can use the raised hand function in the reaction button if you want to ask your question live. So let's begin. We have a question here. Treasurer Young, can you talk a bit more about the Colorado Secure Savings Program? Treasurer Young.
I was going to give you that opportunity to say, I think you're muted, but I beat it to it. It's my favorite line anymore. Is this the one that's in the chat, or is this a different question?
That's one that's in the chat.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing it, but you say it's about the Secure Savings Program?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. Well, yes, I'm happy to talk about it. Again, it's a result of legislation that was passed in the 2020 legislative session, Senate Bill 20-200. And it was, not the first time that the legislature had attempted to pass the bill, but I think what happened was we had the benefit of a few states that got this passed ahead of us: Illinois, California, and particularly Oregon had stepped out in the lead and showed us it was feasible. And essentially, what I said earlier is we have about 1 million workers in the private sector that don't have access to retirement savings through the workplace. And as a result, they're not saving. We know, we did a deep study of this in 2019, that people are not going to be sustainable on Social Security alone. And so when they get to retirement age, they only have two options. If they need to and they don't have the finances to support themselves, they may choose to continue to work. But because a lot of jobs that people do, particularly, and these are low and moderate income jobs, are very taxing physically, they may not physically be able to continue to work. And so if you're not sustainable in retirement, which is not a dignified retirement, you end up on safety net services. Primarily, the bigger driver would be, as a professor pointed out, healthcare. So you're at retirement age, you're eligible for Medicare, but because of your finances, you may also qualify for Medicaid. And we also heard him talk about housing. You may need housing supports because you don't have enough. You may even need food security. You may have food security issues and may need that. And so we have SNAP program, we have Section 8 housing, we have Medicaid, but those are all taxpayer funded programs. And we did an analysis of that. And over the next 15 years, if we didn't do something about this, our costs in those areas would increase by up to $18 billion. That's a big, big number, $18 billion. That's approximately $200 per year for every person in the state of Colorado. So that's an astounding number. And so getting people on a better financial track by allowing them a process to save for retirement to supplement their Social Security changes that financial trajectory, lifts them up into a better chance of a dignified retirement, and doesn't present the taxpayers with a big tax bill. What Oregon did, and California and Illinois also are doing this, is what's called an auto IRA opt-out program. So if a business doesn't have a retirement savings program, then we use payroll deduction through the program we're standing up to allow the employees to save through payroll deduction. And they're automatically enrolled. It's still voluntary. They can opt out if they want to, but we found in the other states, 2/3 to 3/4 of those employees continue to stay in and begin to save. And so it changes the trajectory of the individuals by doing that. And we're steaming along on this. We have a pilot portion of this ready to launch, I think, in October. We hope, and then we'll fully launch in 2023 and roll this out to all employees and employers that don't have already retirement savings. Interesting note also is in our legislation, and the legislators were smart about this, they actually gave us the opportunity to partner with other states, and we've actually been developed a memo of cooperation with New Mexico, who don't have enough employees to actually stand up their own program, but if they collaborate with us, would actually create a larger number of savers, which actually would save us on our fees for fund managers if we did that. And frankly, this is a first in the nation situation, and we have other states around the country that are very interested in reaching out to us as well. So we're very excited about it, and like I said, we're moving as quickly as we can to stand the program up. You got to cut me off. I get excited about this. You got to cut me off, but I mean, it's a big program. We're talking about 1 million people. PARA has about 650,000 people. So we're talking about a program larger than PARA, as a matter of fact.
Thank you, Treasurer Young. Representative Kipp?
Thank you. And yeah, thank you, Treasurer Young, for that program. I think that's really going to help the state of Colorado and people to increase their savings. So I think it's a wonderful program. I do have a question, and maybe this is more of a professor question, but what I'm seeing a lot as I read stuff about the economy and unemployment and employment is kind of, I mean, there's a mismatch, right? We do have lots of people looking for jobs, but some of them are having trouble finding jobs in the areas that are available. Does that make sense? And so I'm just wondering if you guys have any insights, probably particular Professor Fremstad, about that mismatch that seems to be happening between the people who are looking for jobs and the people who have jobs, or people just, you know, saying, well, I'm not going to go to work until somebody pays me a living wage. Or I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on that, because I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, that's obviously a very important point. And I think, I mean, we see unemployment so elevated, which means there are people who are looking for jobs who are not finding them, or not taking them. I think Treasurer Young's analogy to a train getting going after it hasn't been moving, everything's so bouncing around is pretty appropriate. I think a lot of this is sort of temporary, and I think that, you know, changes, what we're seeing is that relative wages are changing for some jobs, and as that gets negotiated between employees and employers, there's going to be a little transitional unemployment. I expect that that's going to continue to fall, and that wages probably continue to go up a little bit at the low end of the labor market, which frankly is exactly what we want and need to happen for this to be an equitable sort of economy. I think it's important, you know, we do hear, I think there's a certain amount of complaining about, like, people want more money to do the same thing, but I mean, we want people to get more money to do the same thing they were doing before too. Wages were very low. They don't cover the cost of living in our community. And so I think it's actually a change we more or less should welcome. And I would expect, if COVID continues to improve and so on, that the unemployment will continue to fall and that wages will continue to go up.
Senator Ginal, do you have a comment?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Beth. And I want to thank Professor Fremstad and also Treasurer Young. But this is more directed towards the professor. And I thought I heard this from some of the perspectives on housing costs and rents. So I'm hearing that you are in favor of rent control, and are you in favor of U+2, or is it the opposite? I'm trying to clarify that.
I think, I mean, I think these are things we just need to be thinking about more, but I think that U+2 to me is a sort of regulation that in an area like ours where housing is so unaffordable, doesn't make sense to me. So I would be for getting rid of U+2. I haven't seen specific local proposals for many forms of rent control besides, I know Representative Boesenecker is working in the context of mobile home parks and so on. But I do know a bunch of cities are reconsidering rent control. And in fact, I mean, my sister lives in New York City, which has re-implemented rent control to a large degree. And I think we should take seriously that in some places, that's what you need to provide renters with the same sort of security that homeowners like myself already enjoy, right? Where I know how much my rent, how much my mortgage is going to be every month for the next 15 years. There are forms of rent control that I think could provide renters with a similar sort of security. I mean, their rents would go up, but it would be capped at a certain amount that could allow renters to have the same sort of security, I guess, that homeowners have in our community.
Just to follow up there to that question, though, I think you're comparing Fort Collins to New York City. And I just to comment that I don't think we can make that comparison as far as rent control goes.
That's, I mean, we're not the same as New York City, but prices, I mean, a 20% increase in rent over the last year is not, I mean, that's more than New York City over the last, few years on average. It's a pretty serious problem.
Thank you, Professor.
And
Emily?
Beth, if I can break in here, I
Sure.
had some people send me questions directly and privately just to me. So I wasn't seeing some of the ones you were seeing, and you're not seeing some of the ones I'm seeing. And I just posted one that came from
Okay.
somebody here in the program, a participant, and I just wanted you to see it and everyone else see it. But we'll take it in the order you want. I just wanted you to be aware that I have some that maybe you don't see.
Okay, Treasurer.
And I'm gonna grab a couple other ones and put them in there, and then you can decide when you want to take.
I'm seeing what you're doing. Thank you so much. That's
You
great.
bet.
Emily, I was going to you. You've had your hand up for a while.
Thanks. So originally my question was going to be for the professor, talking about things we could do locally, but you really just addressed things about wage and U+2 and rent control, which as a renter, I think most people on here are probably homeowners, but as a renter, I'd gladly share my experience of how hard it is here. But because of the question in the chat, I actually wanted to switch and kind of direct this to our treasurer and this idea of Colorado wins and workers having some rights and being able to negotiate and kind of bargain for these sorts of things. And so I think that's huge. And this can kind of maybe tie into that question that you posted about Colorado wins and that being adequately funded. But then also for some of the representatives on the call, there's going to be a bill introduced soon for granting all public workers the right to collective bargaining, which as a professor at CSU, you would be impacted by. For our professor, as an employee of CSU, I would be impacted. So things that would definitely impact the economy and people's, material conditions that would be done through kind of a different thing. So I guess that's a broad question, but for anyone who wants to respond to that.
Well, Emily, I appreciate the question, and certainly, Professor, if you want to dive in, you can as well. I will tell you, and I think Representative Boesenecker referred to this. I had been an educator. If you dig a little bit deeper into that, I actually spent a decade at CU Denver teaching in a master's program, but that was after I had spent 25 years in the K-12 classroom. So I, along the way, was actually the chief bargaining spokesperson over here in Greeley for the Greeley Education Association, and eventually became the president of that union. So I'm, clearly a supporter of collective bargaining and of the rights of people to form unions and address problems, seek solutions, be creative in their efforts. And I think one of the things that we did over in Greeley, and this will tell you a little bit about my trajectory in life, because it was early 80s when I was the president of the Greeley Education Association. But we were one of the first teacher union locals here in Colorado to engage in consensus bargaining. And prior to that, it had been really focused on adversarial bargaining. I think now consensus bargaining is more the model that most school districts pursue. So I think sometimes people get worried about a public sector bargaining bill, as is being proposed by Representative Eskar and Senator Fenberg. But at the end of the day, it's, how that's implemented, I think, makes a big difference. Is it really an effort to solve problems and allow people to have a voice? Often those that are essential workers that are in the front lines know better than even their managers or even the owners or the school board what is actually going on, and have more immediate information and need to be heard, so that good solutions that actually allow, in your case, better instruction to occur. And I'm a big supporter of it. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the long haul, but I'm clearly an advocate for it. How we approach all of these issues collectively, I think, is really is going to be important. I think sometimes we forget we're all in this together, and if we come together, and one of the things I learned in consensus bargaining is we're not in opposition, we're in apposition. We're shoulder to shoulder trying to work together to solve these problems. And I think if it's approached that way, it can be very productive. I don't know if that answers your question. I'll stop there and let even representatives or professor jump in if they want.
Any other comments?
Well, I also support the public sector collective bargaining bill. I think that at any big organization, I think unions and collective bargaining agreements are often what ensure that people are treated fairly. I have a great job at CSU, no complaints about it, but I have a bunch of colleagues who are not in the lucky position I am.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. I have a question here in the chat from Lene Warden, and I believe it's for both Professor Fremstad and Treasurer Young. What impact, if any, is business price gouging having on current inflation rates for housing as well as goods?
Professor?
Well, this is a hard,
That was pretty slick how I did that, wasn't it?
Right. Price gouging is a hard thing to measure. It can seem like it's an eye beholder, I think. And ultimately, the prices that businesses can charge, that landlords can charge, is always sort of a result of like, well, how competitive is the market they're in right now. So I don't know if I'd call it price gouging, but I do think that rents and homes going up in price 20% over the last year is a serious problem. And that what we need to do is we need to help push the market in a direction where things are more affordable by having more competition or policies that restrain how much you can increase the rates and so on. But I think those are precisely the things we need to think about. I don't usually think about as price gouging per se, but prices are going up a lot in certain areas.
And I will just dive in. I think it's a complicated situation. You know, when the pandemic first hit and the economy really dropped off, there was concern that people and businesses would actually be able to pay their property taxes. And there were a lot of entities coming to us in the Treasury saying we want forgiveness or deferral of our property taxes. And we certainly want to help people that way, but you have to remember that these things are all connected together. And our special districts, including school districts, fire protection districts, water, sanitation, library, I mean, go down the list of all of the different entities that rely on property tax. And if you don't collect those entities begin to suffer. And those are essential in many, many cases. Well, every one of them I list are essential services. So, you know, you have to kind of work through that. And the legislature actually passed a bill in the last session in response to the concern about increasing housing prices, particularly for homeowners, about what might happen to their property taxes. And we've actually come through the legislature. We had an existing program called the Senior and Active Military Deferral Program. Now, this isn't the homestead exemption. This is different. This is the ability to defer payment and actually take out a loan or a lien on your home, so you don't pay your taxes. It comes back as a loan connected at an interest rate that is on the 10-year treasuries. And you can pay it back right away the next year, or you can continue to defer and maybe let your estate pay for that. That's what seniors often do. Active military might defer for a year or two, but the legislature said we're going to expand that to all homeowners. And so we're actively working on a massive program to extend this program of deferral out to all homeowners. So if they have significant increases in their property taxes, that there's a way to deal with that in the short term. Doesn't mean they're forgiven from paying them, but we will backfill that as a state. And I know the Joint Budget Committee, because I presented to them early this past week, is considering how that fits in with the budget and what we can actually afford as a state. I know we have a big budget, and it connects to the other question that was posted, but we have, I think, our budget divided up the right way. The slices of the pie are very similar to what you see in many other states, but frankly, the size of the pie for the state of Colorado is not big enough. And so we do struggle trying to meet the actual essential needs of people here in the state of Colorado. And I will in part point a finger at Tabor, because it is the most restrictive tax and expenditure provision in the Constitution of any state in the country. And it really does restrict our ability to meet these essential needs. And I know sometimes people blame the legislature, but the legislature doesn't have control over the provisions that are in the Constitution. Only the voters have control of that. So I want to be a little protective of our legislators. Somebody said, well, why don't you do something about that, Treasurer Young? Well, I speak out about it, but you know, at the end of the day, my job is not to decide how money is going to be spent. My job is just make sure we meet our obligations day by day, minute by minute within the within the revenues that have been provided by the taxpayers. And so it's a conundrum. We've got to work together as a state to decide what kind of state we want to be and how we might have a rational tax policy that actually allows us to fund the essential services that we really want to have to make our state move forward.
Thank you, Treasurer Young. We have less than 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to move us to closing remarks, and I'm hoping that as each of you do offer those remarks, that you let people know how their questions can be answered that were sent in today. And then unfortunately, we just didn't have time to address. So Treasurer Young, Professor Fremstad, do you have closing remarks?
Professor, please go ahead.
Well, I see there are a couple other questions about credit unions and honestly, I mean, so I guess all I can say is it was nice to be here with you. And if you have other questions you'd like to follow up with me about, you can email me at anders.fremstad@colostate.edu. I'd be happy to think about something like that with you more. I don't know about all these things, but as a public economist or economist working for the state of Colorado, I'm happy to help you answer these questions to the extent I can.
Thank you. Treasurer Young?
Well, thank you, Beth, and thanks to all of you who joined today. It's great to see so many people. I saw a lot of my friends that I've known for a long time have joined as well, so thank you for that, and all the legislators that have hosted this, really appreciate that. I did post in the chat, hopefully you saw that, my treasurer.young@state.co.us. So if you want a copy of the slides that I presented today or you want an additional response on a question that didn't get answered, feel free to email me and I will be happy to help you out in that way. I think we're all dedicated to making sure that we move forward as a state. I'll just highlight one practical thing that the legislature did in 2020, and that was to stand up a Climber Small Business Loan Program. And I had mentioned this earlier. You can learn more about that. climber-colorado.com is the address, but we are actively trying to restart our small business economy because we know it's overrepresented in our economy. And if we can do that, this really does stabilize our economy as a state and move us forward. So we've tried to focus our work in the Treasury along with the legislature on really what matters and what will make a difference. And we continue to work on that. But we're always open to your ideas and suggestions, and don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Treasurer Young. Senator Ginal?
Yes, thanks to our presenters. I appreciate your presentations and thanks to everyone else who came to listen today, and I hope it was helpful. I see a lot of comments, and I think this is an interest for everybody. And I just really appreciate this forum. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Kipp?
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and thanks to our presenters, our moderators. I wanted to mention to everybody that next month's issue forum, which is probably, I think it's the 4th Saturday of the month, is going to be on affordable housing. So I think that's really related to the economy and the state of the economy. So I hope you can join us for that one. You know, that's one of those big issues that's not just affecting us here in Fort Collins or along the Front Range, it's affecting people in Colorado statewide. So it's really important. We have to have more housing, right? You know, I think it's a supply demand thing. We probably should have asked our experts, but what we're doing with some of the one-time funding is trying to shore up the supply of affordable and attainable housing in Colorado, and also deal with the issue of homelessness. So I just wanted to throw that out there, but thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Representative Young?
Thank you, everyone, for being here. The wonderful questions. I'm going to say my email address, and I'm asking my husband to put it in the chat because I don't have access to everyone. It's repmmcyoung@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. And he followed my request. He put it in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you. And Representative Boesenecker?
Well, yes, thank you, Beth, for moderating. And of course, thank you, Treasurer Young and Professor Fremstad for a really engaging presentation. You gave us a lot to think about and certainly, I think, rounded out the picture here for everybody who was listening. So really appreciate that. Wanted to flag that Treasurer Young did put his email in the chat if you'd like a copy of those slides. Certainly appreciate that. And Professor Fremstad did as well. So appreciate being able to be with my colleagues today, and certainly all of you for participating in a conversation on a Saturday morning. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'd like to echo my thanks to all the presenters today. And thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.